Perfect. So welcome everybody to our webinar today, where we will be discussing the importance of AI ethics with Polenomy. Really looking forward to hearing your talk, Polenomy, and thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we start the very interesting talk, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Crystal Hastings. I'm the head of marketing at FinChatbot, and I will be your host for this webinar. A quick agenda, I will do an introduction to why we have these talks and a little bit about who hosts them. Then we'll go into the talk. We've got a total of 9 polls to go through in the talk, so we really want it to be quite interactive and really get an idea of what your thoughts are around the topic. And then we'll try and do a Q&A at the end so we can answer any questions that you may have. So I've got a quick video to share with you about why we have these webinars. So enjoy. So as you see, these webinars are hosted by FinChatbot and French Tech, and our main goal is to build a community of students, entrepreneurs, corporates, tech enthusiasts, a full community so that we can support each other and grow and learn together. So if you'd like to know more about FinChatbot or French Tech, or just get in touch to have a chat, you can visit us on our website, and you can also email us at hello@finchatbot.com. And that's me. So I'd like to hand over to Polenomy. And also thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you for everybody joining us today. And I really hope that you enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, Crystal. I hope everyone can hear me all right. I'm speaking to this little mic thing. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. So yeah, my name is Polenomy, and thank you to Crystal and your team and the FinChatbot team for giving me a platform to talk. I would like to put out a disclaimer that I am by no means an ethics expert. And actually, when Dale sent me the heading of the thing being like the importance of AI ethics, I was like, I don't know if that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about, but it'll attract the right crowd. And really what I would like to do today is to just really get people involved in the conversation around some things that I myself, as a non-white and non-male AI or machine learning developer, is going through in the world and in search of tools that can help me create things for people like me and the people that I care about who aren't necessarily being covered at the moment. So yeah, I suppose we'll get right into it. So the first time I did this kind of talk at FinChatbot, I talked about my father's expansion theory. He doesn't call it that, I call it that. So I'm going to continue with the theme of the expansion theory. And what this expansion theory entails is that everything in the universe aims to mimic the universe in its natural affinity to expand. And my father spoke about it in a way of like, you know, you have nature, which tries to expand and to grow. You have living organisms like human beings who also try to expand and to grow. And he says that humans are special because we don't just try to expand in a physical sense, we also try to expand in terms of our minds and our capabilities. And with this, it brings on the expansion of technology, right? A couple of years ago in Cyril's address, he spoke about giving tablets to to all the children in the country. And so with this advent of OIR, of course, its limelight has been stolen a little bit by COVID. There has been this expansion in technology, and over the last 10 or 20 years within my lifetime, technology has changed drastically. And so computers and data analytics used to be for a select number of people who had access to these kinds of things, but it's very quickly meant to touch everyone who exists in the world, all over the world, whether you're from a rural village or from a big city in a first world country. And it's not just touching everybody, but it's also touching everything that we interact with, and more so as we move forward into the future. So it's healthcare, it's transport, it's shopping, and everything else. But because it affects everything, it can also affect things in not so great ways. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples from 2020 of where AI has affected things in undesirable ways. And yeah, there's plenty more from history of time, but I'm just going to look at a few from 2020. So one of the ways it's affected the world is with law and regulation. This is a picture from a paper where a deep neural network was used to try and detect criminality in people's faces. This is not the first time that AI has tried to be used to detect criminality, and it is still currently being used in order to detect criminality. There was a case in the US, a number of cases where Black men have been falsely accused and falsely arrested based off of being recognized facially. We know from the historically, like last year or a couple of years before, the Compass survey is a system that gets used currently in the US in order to gauge criminality for convicts to see how likely they are to reoffend. This paper, luckily, people protested against it and it wasn't allowed to be published, and it was removed from the journal that it was published to. In October, GPT-3 based chatbot designed to reduce doctors' workloads was tested in a trial where it suggested that a simulated mentally ill patient should kill themselves. The same kind of GPT-3 algorithm has shown to expose a lot of anti-Muslim bias. This, as well as a whole lot of other arrays of issues with language models, are covered in a really great paper that was released earlier this year on the dangers of stochastic parrots by Timnit and her colleagues. She was fired for this paper, so you better go read it, because otherwise we've lost a big contributor to the world of AI ethics for nothing. And so, yeah, we have these things affecting, and language is something that touches everything, right? It's medicine, it's education, it's the environment. The environment is something that gets covered quite a bit in the paper, how training these huge language models are contributing to climate change because of the amount of resources they're required to train. Twitter and Zoom was racist last year. Everyone's always racist. This guy on the right, Colin, posted this thread about how the background thingamabob in Zoom kept on ignoring his colleague's face. You can guess what race the colleague was belonging to. And then he found that when he posted this complaint on Twitter, so he posted this very image and then another image where his colleague's face was in fact present in the picture, and Twitter automatically cropped the face to include his face rather than his colleague's face. And that was a huge row. Something very serious, this guy was fired. His name's Neil Ferguson. He is an epidemiologist and has been doing predictions and forecasting for all sorts of diseases. COVID-19 was one of them. He also did it on SARS and MERS previously. And even though all his predictions in the past have been incorrect, last year it was particularly severe because his predictions, and I mean, he's from Imperial College London, his predictions informed policy that was then put into place by the UK government and resulted in the situation they now find themselves in some ways, contributing to the many more infections that were necessary. Whoopsie, no Siri, go away. Many more infections and many more deaths. This was also released last year, this Genderify app that claimed to be able to identify your gender by analyzing your name, username, or email address. Consequently, typing in the word professor into Genderify gave a 98.4% male prediction, and the word stupid a 61.7% female prediction. And this ties into the GPT-3 and other language model problems that we are incurring of these things that have been unleashed onto the world. And this one I have included because of how things have unfolded currently. So in 2018, the UN ruled that Facebook played a determining role in the Myanmar genocide. And what was crazy about that is that when Facebook was notified that this was in fact happening and that their platform was being used to spread misinformation and hate, they didn't really respond. I think circled in that top little orange circle says that they employed dozens of people to try and fix the problem or to do some kind of content screening. However, in comparison, Facebook hired hundreds to comply with the hate speech law that Germany had put in place. And I think here the point is that Facebook was more reactive to the threat of a financial penalty than to the systematic destruction of an ethnic minority. This one is also another one I shared before. The first time I shared it, it was an actual app that you could download on the App Store. The next time, a couple of times I shared it as this X-ray app that was being put up for sale. And the third time I'm now sharing it is as a result of a report by Sensity, I think they're called, where this app is just technology. It uses deep neural networks to remove clothes off of women. It doesn't work on men, probably doesn't work on Black women either. But it was found that, Telegram, this thing has come back up on Telegram and is being used as a service via a Telegram bot. And that report was released in 2019. And because it is Telegram, it's a little bit difficult to pin down who is responsible and how they can be punished, because Telegram is about privacy and protecting people's rights to their own stuff, right? And when you have these kinds of things, you may be led to believe that robots are out to destroy us. They're out to get us. This is a funny gif. If you don't know the background story to this, they made this wonderful android, and they were super excited about displaying her and to the world in the best way possible. When I say the word display, wrong word choice. But they asked her the wrong question, and she gave an answer that was particularly problematic, and it was in an interview, so it was on TV, and you can see it by that guy's awkward smile laugh thing that he didn't want that to happen. And so, yeah, the machines aren't actually out to get us, even if it may seem that they are. Who's really out to get us is the creators of these machines. Machines just follow instructions. They only do what they're told to do. And if they're told to do something and we realize we didn't tell it to them, then it is us, the machine creators, who are at fault. And so with this machine creation process, we have these three steps, right? We have this machine conceptualization where we have this problem we want to solve. We have a machine development phase where we go through the process of looking at historical data, for example, and training a model in order to be able to optimize for a particular metric that indicates that we've solved a particular problem. And then once we've trained this thing, we then release it into the world. Ooh, my little people disappeared. And generally, when we have these bad machines, we have this diagnosis response, right? Where in the machine conceptualization step, we're just like, oh, it's bad data. Oh, when people say that on the social medias, I get so angry. They're like, oh no, it's not the algorithm. It's because the data was bad, or it's a bad problem conceptually. and it just shouldn't be done, like the nudes thing. And then if it's not that the fault is at that point of the process, it may be in the algorithm development, where we have these bad black box algorithms. We don't really know what we have told them to do, and then they do the wrong thing. But we only find that out when we release it out into the world, and not necessarily we're developing it because we don't understand what the steps the machine are taking to make a particular decision. And then we have this after stage in terms of the machine release. And here we have lack of regulation and lack of accountability. And at any point of this process, if they're not covered properly, then we get this bad AI that does like bad stuff. So I'd just quickly like to go over some of my pet peeves with regards to the issues within these 3 steps, a little bit more detail. So in terms of machine conceptualization, my pet peeves are within metrics and data. So metrics are the thing that we train a machine to optimize for. So a score, basically, a number. And problem with metrics is that not all problems can be measured. So for example, if you're trying to detect fraud, yeah, sure, that's easy. Something is either fraud or it's not fraud, and you can assign a number to that quite easily. If fraud can be 1 and not fraud can be 0. However, if the issue is a little bit more nuanced than that, so for example, YouTube trying to optimize engagement as a metric doesn't really exist in the world, which is the second point, metrics are proxies for unmeasurable things, then we have to kind of decide what we determine engagement to be in a way that we can measure and in a way that we can teach to machines in a number form. And when that happens, somebody's just decided what the number for engagement is. And it then means that we can teach machines the wrong thing. So for example, in the case of YouTube, they decided engagement was like watching time, which kind of makes sense, except the algorithm figured out that the way to keep people watching stuff is to promote extremism. And this is found to be particularly problematic. We've just heard in the news recently in terms of people of Asian descent in America, particularly being targeted by extremists. So you can understand that when metrics are not measuring something correctly, they can then further perpetuate bias and awful things in the world that we don't really want to. And the third point about this is that metrics can be gamed. I'll give a lighter example. Originally, Google's search algorithm didn't look at any like invisible text within articles on the web. So what people were doing is in like white text on a white background, just writing all the keywords that Google would look for. And because the metric was just looking for particular keywords, those articles will pop up even if they were completely irrelevant because of the hidden text. Another pet peeve in this stage is the data I mentioned previously. So contrary to popular belief, data does not speak for itself. So if an algorithm is racist, it's not because the data is racist. Data cannot be racist. It's the interpretation and the human imposition of what we think and what we believe that then turns data into something that has meaning in the world. And this is particularly important because of the second point where we measure what we think is important. So there is a case, for example, with pregnant women, where we have a lot of data about pregnant women while they're pregnant and healthy, because pregnancy can be commodified and it can create money through various capitalistic means around getting women to prepare for their baby and for the birth of a child. However, trying to collect data on deaths through pregnancy or deaths through giving birth is a lot more difficult. And that can't be commodified. And that kind of represents what we find important in terms of a woman's pregnancy cycle, much more about the baby and not necessarily when that baby causes a problem with the mother's health. And then common response is more data. They talk about this in that stochastic parrots paper with the GPT-3 and the other language models, that more data isn't always enough because data is particular to a particular context, right? So for example, if we go to China, for example, and we ask everyone what they think about the government, it doesn't matter how many people you ask about the government, they're all going to give a particular answer. And it's not necessarily because it's a representation of the truth, it's a representation of the context in which that data was collected. Then the next point is something that, people data is kind of dehumanizing. What you do is you take people, you take lives, the context with which they live in, the connections with the people and the place that they live in, and you turn them into a number. So instead of us now saying that these are the people who have a low credit risk score because, or high credit risk score because they're high risk, we shouldn't give them loans. That's kind of what we're looking at, rather than saying, oh, wait, these are people that were previously disadvantaged or oppressed and are now marginalized people, and they actually need to be handled in different ways. So data can be dehumanizing, which is very problematic. And then the last point is that data is historical, right? So when we're training a model, and this point is really funny because what we're trying to do is make better predictions for the future so we can make better decisions about the future, right? But we're using historical data in order to train models today to make those better predictions for the future. So it's a really difficult thing to try and do that successfully because we know that there's problematics in the past that we are trying to fix moving forward. Pet peeves within machine development. The first is that math is seen as objective. You show people a chart, they're likely to believe it, just because maths is scary for most people. Second, that algorithms hide created decisions. So when we create machine learning models, there are a whole lot of steps and points of consideration that we go through when creating these models, what features we're going to include, what features we're not going to include, how long we're going to train it for, what its focus is going to be, what its outcomes need to be. And when you have a model that just makes decisions about things, those decisions are hidden. Those little nitty-gritty pieces of information that were involved in the process of developing it. Then something that's been talked about quite often is that algorithms thrive on bias. The next point is something that's quite dear to my heart about misunderstanding algorithms drives misuse, and this is particularly for AI practitioners or data scientists alike, and really understanding the limitations of the types of models that we use. Yeah, so for example, some models work on biased data, some do not. Some work on unbalanced data, some do not. But often we're just like, oh, this guy works for most things, let's just use this thing. And because we're so determined to get a product out, we don't necessarily pay enough attention to what the algorithm's capabilities are. And then in a similar way that data can be dehumanizing for humans, algorithms are kind of discretizing of the world's issues. So what we do is we take this little chunk of a problem and we're like, a machine can solve for this little problem. But what we do when we isolate that problem from the world, we kind of forget that it's part of a bigger system and contributes to a greater whole. Pet peeves within the machine release stage are with regards to accountability of us machine learning developers and the models that we release. So firstly, there's no warning labels on models and there's no regulation in place to make sure that there's no warning labels. When you buy cigarettes, it tells you you'll get cancer. When you download Instagram, it doesn't tell you that it will possibly affect your mental health because it will represent things that you aspire to rather than things that are realistic for your life. And warning label things is also another thing that gets talked about in that stochastic Parrots paper in terms of us actually releasing machines with what they were trained on, what they were made for, and the assumptions that were made in that process. False interpretation, which is again something that I've spoken about with maths being seen as objective. And this was seen a lot in the US elections. So for example, Texas on the American map was shown big and red and everyone was like, oh, this is so scary, which it was, won't lie. But there were also a whole lot of little teeny tiny little Biden areas that actually had more people, but that map representation wasn't necessarily representative of the truth of the situation at that point. And then, yeah, we've inherited all of these models and these data sets from neocolonial powers. So for example, the largest image data set in the world, ImageNet, is something that gets used by so many visual processing algorithms that get used in driving cars and facial detection and other stuff. But 2/3 of that data set come from the Western world, which is problematic if you're trying to then use those models and that data set within a South African context, for example, and you want to to identify your bup and your stony and your acha, and it's just like, I don't know what that is, even though it has billions and billions of images. That image doesn't represent our reality. And then in terms of regulation, we currently have no data science regulating committee. So literally anyone can go onto the web and take a couple of data science courses and be like, I'm a data scientist, which is really cool because it does open doors to people who otherwise wouldn't have opportunities. But it does also mean that we have all sorts of people who are data scientists. Doesn't necessarily mean that they've gone through any kind of formal training with human issues or anything like that, which can be a little bit scary. I know in architecture, there's a regulation committee, in engineering, in all these big fields that make decisions about how people live. There's a committee that's like, this is how it should be done. We don't have one. Then POPI and GDPR are kind of the only laws universally that are really implemented with a focus on something that is affected by AI, which is the privacy of personal information. But with regards to anything else AI related, we don't really have regulation other than like the Bill of Human Rights or the Constitution and what it means to a person's like livelihood. But there isn't much specific regulation around what should be done and what shouldn't be done. And in that same boat, we have poor ethics frameworks, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and then poor transformation. Gosh, I was having a discussion with somebody the other day, doing a very bad job at trying to convince them why more transformation was required in the workplace. And it was really just embarrassing. But I was so unprepared because I live in this bubble where everyone thinks transformation is important. And then I was met with this elderly white dude, and I just couldn't defend the argument. I'll be better prepared next time. So the idea then is that if we have good methodology addressing all of these problems at each of those points, so for example, context-driven success criteria in the machine conceptualization phase and algorithm fairness, which, by the way, Karen spoke about interpretable models, I think, last month. So if you want to do a little bit more work there, you should go check out her talk. And in the machine release phase, with regards to policy and accountability, then we will have good AI. Everything will be great. A lot of this stuff is covered in the FACT conference, which I think was also a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe last week. I can't remember what are days these days. There's a really cool paper on algorithmic fairness that you should have a read if you're also interested in that. And then with regards to machine release, Timonet has a paper of data sheets for data sets, and the IBM team has come up with a model data sheet in order to put all the caveats of a machine learning model in them in order to release it with a little bit more context. So those are all good things to employ. However, as I mentioned before, humans are inputting decisions and points of view into each step of this process, which means that if we're going to apply these methods to ensure that all these things are doing the right thing, then it requires for all of us to be on the same page about what is the right thing. And what that means is that we have the same kind of page or ideas around morality, prejudice, fairness, transparency, interpretability, robustness, so how a machine is able to work in some place as well as it does in another, and also in accountability. But now you can imagine that in different places of the world, we have different kind of ideas of what this means. So, for example, morality-wise, in some places of the world, you should cover yourself completely. And that is a moral thing to do. In other places, you can walk around in a thong on the beach or naked on the beach, and that is absolutely okay to do. And so when we try to apply a global standard of what these things should be, what we're actually doing is applying plasters on these technical processes that can occur. Because if we're not all on the same page about morality and all these other things listed at the bottom, then it doesn't quite matter what we do in the machine development stage if we're actually not on the same page about what is important and what is not, and what is good and what is not. And basically, when we're looking at it in a global perspective, what we do find is that it doesn't localized to a particular location in terms of what we care about. And what we're actually following is the hegemony, right? We're maintaining the status quo. So this is why we have problems with machines being racist or being sexist or binary or whatever it is, because we think we're on the same plane, but actually we're on the playing field of a particular minority that exists in the world. And Abiba, in her Toward Decolonizing Computer Science paper, speaks about this in terms of chair, right? So in this world, we have people who are very comfortable. And we describe that environment as being the chair. And when someone else sits in the chair and they're trying to describe how that chair is not comfortable for them, how the world is not comfortable for them, it's really difficult for those who are super comfy to relate. But more problematic than that is the fact that a lot of the people who are comfortable in the chairs are the people who teach our machines what is comfortable. And that can be a problem too. So, I put masks on there. So we have a whole lot of people sitting in this chair that is not comfortable for them, but they have to just go about their lives and go about living in this world that is not set up for them in certain ways because they do not belong to the status quo. And then we have the status quo who just doesn't understand why this chair isn't comfortable for everyone else and is also teaching all the machines what their idea of comfort is, which is where we now find ourselves. So in a sense, the machines aren't out to get us in like understanding us. And that's because their creators aren't, because we have a whole lot of people in the status quo creating for us who actually don't understand our reality. So I would like to look at where this chair comes from and why it's not comfortable for everyone. And I think I have to do this quite quickly in 7 minutes. So where does the chair come from? And I'm going to give you my convenient summary of AI history that helps to drive my points home. But firstly, that modern science is built upon rationality. So this is also with the ideas of mathematics being objective. This rationality idea is that computers are logical and built with reason, and therefore cannot be wrong. The second is that modern stats is built upon eugenics. This is also highlighted in Abiba's paper on decolonizing computer science. And you'll see that the stats that we use in our machine learning models, because if you didn't know, machine learning is just stats. That stats was birthed in order to compare the differences between different people. So specifically like measuring the circumference of people's heads or the noses or the differences between their eyes in order to lift up some people and push down others. AI was born of war. The word AI was initially like instantiated at this conference called the Dartmouth Conference or something like that in the 1950s. Where a whole lot of computer practitioners came together and brainstormed over a couple of days about what the future of computers kind of looked like in the world. And they came up with the word artificial intelligence, but that conference was funded by an organization called DARPA. And DARPA is basically the US Defense Force. And not only was that conference, but a lot of computer development after that, especially in the competition between Russia and the US, and UK was involved in that too, was funded by war. So for example, the birth of NLP was trying to decode Russian messages so that they could intercept them as a means of war. And that's where a lot of the concepts that we now deal with today come from. The next step is that AI has been propelled by capitalism. So after it wasn't so cool to be part of wars anymore, we then started using AI in order to commodify certain things, in order to sell, in order to make money, and in order for some people to progress faster than others. And then the last point is that history omits contributions conveniently. So not only is this the history that we then can extract about the AI's process, but we can also quite evidently see that that history belongs to a certain set of people, and those people definitely do not look like the people on the right. even though all of those people have been very integral to the development of AI and computer science and computers in general, computing in general. Often we're not told about their stories, unless you're someone like me who cares about them. But otherwise, yeah, comfy chair. And this chair is really informed by this history, right? And where this history comes from is like the philosophy or the foundational principles of science, and how that then informs ethics. So philosophy in terms of our knowledge acquisition and what we believe to be important then determines what we then have as guidances and how we act in the world with our ethics. And our ethics then confirm our, or result in biases. So our point of view of the world and our certain prejudices that we have about certain groups of people or whatever. And each of these inform the methodology in that machine creation process. So we're about to go into some of the polls, and first is around philosophy. And I mean, this isn't the general term of like philosophy as a description. This is more in terms of the philosophical foundational principles of like science and AI. But here, the definition from Google says the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. So first poll, and I'm going to move through these quite quickly because I'm not talking fast enough. Should have made the presentation shorter. But should AI be purely rational? So should it be purely logical and reasonable? Second question. This is the Dartmouth proposal at the Dartmouth conference in the 1950s. So every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. Do you agree? Yes or no? And which would you prefer for yourself? To get to where you need to go quickly by yourself, or to get where you need to go more slowly with other people and possibly going further too? So these three questions, hopefully you'll answer them before I move on to this next point, but these are the current definitions of humanity as viewed by machines, and they are very much Western inspired. So the idea of rationality, that machines should be reasonable and logic. The idea of functionalism, that the world can be separated into these little independent modelable bits that can be distinguished from each other. And individualism, which in turn has kind of driven capitalism. So the idea that the individual's human rights, the individual's wants and desires are of importance, and possibly more so than the idea of community or society as a whole. Comfy. Next thing we're moving on to is ethics. And these are the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity, often inspired by our foundational ideas of what knowledge and the important things of life are, that foundational philosophy. So this is a common ethics question. Which path would you choose? Would you choose the path B, where you can divert, where you can just leave the train track to keep running and to kill 5 people? Or would you choose path A, where you then interfere with fate and you direct the train trolley to kill 1 person instead of 5? Next question. If loss of job security due to AI influence, who is able to secure wealth? Who is entitled to wealth resulting from AI technologies? Is it the companies who own rights to the technology? Is it the minority who produced it? Or is it everyone, regardless if they were involved in the creation or not? Normally people answer this question unanimously, but then I would implore you to have a look at the world and to these companies that are very much technically based, and then to think about where that wealth is in fact actually going, because I can assure you it's not going to everyone. Privacy or surveillance for social security. I mentioned that thing about that app, what's it called? Something with the T. I forgot. But anyway, the privacy that's protecting people from sharing that that nude app. But also your privacy is really important, and your information as a person is important because it's making people money in the world. And it's because it's your information, and part of being a human is having will, and you should have the will about whether you want to share that or not. So this is the ethics guide as released by the EU Commission for Trustworthy AI. It's a lot longer, of course, it's a whole report, but the main 7 points are these 7 points. But what I would like to highlight here is that these will still serve the foundational principles of science that we are currently following in terms of rationality, functionalism, and individualism. And this is pertinent, especially in like that point 6, where it says societal and environmental well-being is a really important part of the ethics framework. But when they talk about environmental well-being here, they're specifically talking about preserving the environment for future generations. And if you're an indigenous person that doesn't necessarily belong to the Western world, this can be very problematic. So for example, if you're the Ainu in Japan, or you are the Aboriginals in Australia, a very important part of your culture and of your person and your definition of humanity is the idea that the environment and yourself are one with each other. And that the reason why you conserve the environment is not in order to preserve yourself and your future generations, but just out of pure respect for what the environment is and what nature is and what it gives to you and what you can give to it. So here we can see that even though there may be these guidelines that are set out for the world to follow, they may not necessarily be relevant for every location. So these things then inform our biases, right? And bias is an inclination or prejudice for or against one person or group, especially in a way considered to be unfair. So there are many, many different types of biases. These are just a list from that link. But if you Google biases on Wikipedia, there's like over 50. It's crazy. And when you read through them, it's really interesting to see how your mind tricks you into believing that your reality is the most important one, when there are so many different other realities and so many different points of view. So experts suggest that what is the first step to unraveling unconscious bias, and this is particularly within the workplace, is it internal audit. So making sure you have an internal system that makes sure that you're doing the right thing. Is it awareness training? So training your employees or your people to make sure that they are aware. Is it surveying candidates? So barring certain types of people from entry into your area of operation, like, oh no, that dude's whack, he's not allowed in. Or is it through policy? So external audit or external regulation. Biases often surface in the workplace when people are drawn to others who share the same hobbies or pursuits, creating an affinity bias that can affect resume screening, career advancement, and product development. True or false? And I think this one's particularly important in a place like South Africa, where we are going through a transformative process where corporate landscapes, NGO landscapes are starting to look a little bit different as people gain access to opportunities and tertiary education and start entering in the workplace. Yep. So just a reminder that bias is personal. It's a perspective. It is not the perspective. And in order to explore this further, I encourage you to take the implicit association tests, or the IATs. They are tests that test your unconscious bias. And it's really interesting because there was a dude who took this test and realized that he had an implicit bias against Black people, which was really interesting because he was a Black man himself. And the story gets even cooler because he then takes the test again a little bit later on, and he's no longer has an implicit association, negative one, to Black people. And so the first point here is that your biases can change depending on the environment that you are currently operating in and your mental state. But also, he realized that the reason why his bias had changed is because he had watched Bolt win the Olympics. And it just had spoken to how faith in his own people had changed his view of the world and of his people just by seeing one of his own excel and be brilliant. So just moving on to why this is a problem. So AI is difficult to define, but the fourth industrial revolution is kind of being broadly conceptualized as the idea of the convergence of people and technology. And so when we know that people and technology, the line between us is being a little bit blurred, then we know that these things are very, very much connected. And in which ways? So this is a machine learning pipeline, machine learning where we teach machines how to solve problems. And generally, it's this problem goes to machine learning, which, as I mentioned earlier, is just super fantastic statistics. And out of it, you get a solution. But in the world, we have intentions and actions. And when intentions are aligned with actions, we can have either a good machine or a bad machine. But we can also have this area in between where we have mistakes, where intentions and actions are misaligned. So we have a whole lot of people who really just want to do good. They just don't know how, so they make a mistake, right? And this then means that there's actually more opportunity for bad things to happen, because it means that mistakes are grouped into that bad group. And this is how we get things like the epidemiologist predicting the wrong thing. The bad intention, bad action would be like the removal of clothes of a woman. And so when we're looking at this machine learning development pipeline, what we're actually looking at is that machines are a combination of fantastic stats, yes, but they're also a combination of the status quo, or this chair, that gets embedded in via human input. And the reason why this is a problem is because this input of the status quo of that chair results in a creation or a sustenance of the current power imbalances in the world. And when we have the assignment of power to a certain body, it means a disempowerment of another body. And that sucks, this unintentional maliciousness. It sucks when you are the target. It sucks if you are someone who cares about other human targets. It also sucks if you're a human who cares for sustainability of your business or whatever, because when the people are unhappy because they're all targets, then they result in an instability of the current system, and therefore just cannot last forever. And then it's also a problem if you're a human who cares for your ego and you want to stay relevant. You can't not transform, because then your business just won't thrive or whatever. And then also if you're a capitalist, but I've crossed that out because I don't necessarily believe in motivating people to exploit the resources of people who already don't have. So it does help if you're a capitalist, because it means that you want to do better in your business and get more money by being more relevant and expanding your user base and caring about more people in terms of your user base. But I'm not going to promote that. And in South Africa, what does this look like, right? We have this crazy major inequality where privileged are processed by people and the poor are being processed by algorithms. And what this also entails is that we have this top minority that's creating for a lower majority. And so I have this question for you. Do you think you are in the top 3% of earners in this country, i.e., like the top minority? And then I'll let you know, if you earn over 15,000 Rand a month, you are in the top 3% of earners in this country, i.e., you are the top minority. And when we look at this top minority and the status quo that we are helping to maintain, we realize that the status quo doesn't necessarily deal with a lot of the issues that the country faces. So in terms of understanding land, nowhere in that ethics framework by the EU do they mention land or relationships with land. We have specific issues around gender violence and generational trauma, crime and safety. And we know that the norm in the world isn't what these things are, and what we're actually having to deal with. And so that chair is not relevant to our context, and we need to be careful about applying it to our context. And so my final message, I guess, is that this chair is not always comfy. And we can't stop centering the people who this chair is comfortable for. We need more chairs. And we need to center the people who these technologies are capable of harming, because more often than not, the people that it harms are already people who have been harmed and hurt so much. And this comes through changing that history, I guess, moving forward, but also reconsidering those foundational philosophical principles about what we understand to be good practices of obtaining knowledge and developing humanhood and ethics. A really cool paper by Sabelo Mshambi is the one I put at the bottom there, talking about the difference between rationality and rationality and relationality, and using Ubuntu as a framework for ethics. And it's really, really interesting because it just speaks to humanhood. And like, just imagine if machines were made with Ubuntu in mind, right? And caring about other people and caring about the community. I think we would have a very different view of what scary machines would look like. And so, yeah, leaving you with this Kwame Nkrumah quote, where it says, "Others may feel that they evolved the very best way of life, but we are not bound slavish imitators to accept it as our mold. If we find methods used by others are suitable to our social environments, we shall adopt or adapt them. If we find them unsuitable, we shall reject them." Yeah, and some final resources, but that's it from me. I've gone over time, but hopefully there's still a little bit more time to chat.
Wow, thank you so much, Palenami. That was extremely interesting. It kind of made me think about, I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was talking about the different diets that people go for. You know, you got the Atkins diet and the juicing diet, and so many. And often what happens is they do a research paper on a particular diet, and they find research because they want to prove what they're after for that particular diet. And they find research that, you know, says, great, this diet works. And they don't necessarily look at the research that doesn't really prove that the diet works. And that's why you have these kind of rolling diets and books and everything that come out, because there's this paper that supports it. And then you've got another researcher that goes out and says, you know, this clearly doesn't work. And then everyone stops the diet and moves to the next one. So it's kind of, you know, like it's kind of related in that you need to question what you're reading. You need to question things more than just accepting it at face value, accepting that a paper's right or a technology does things correctly. So questioning is important. And I also saw that you addressed the sort of South Africa. You've got the, you know, there's two images, one of, you know, the suburb view, and one where it's not really looked after, where you have a lot of poverty, etc. And Rossetti does a really, really great talk on that, where she's done a lot of computer vision research into those areas to get more understanding. And that's extremely interesting. So yeah, we would love to have a talk with Rossetti and cover that topic a little bit more. Yeah, so thank you. That was extremely interesting. I don't see any questions besides for everybody would love the video and we can absolutely share with everybody. And I think what we can do, just on the basis of time, we can look at the polls and we can create graphs around them and maybe what they mean, or what was the correct or incorrect answer if there was one. And when we send out our newsletter and our messages to everybody that joined, we can just give you those results so you can have a look through those.
That'll be cool. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And if anyone has any questions or comments, I mean, this is a process I'm going through myself. So very open to discussing this, and especially disagreements, because I find myself in a little bubble where I think everyone cares about the things that I do, and then I realize people don't. So please engage with me on Twitter or on Instagram or anything like that. I would love to hear more about people's experiences. Yeah, and questions.
Awesome. I see two questions. So Kieran has a question. She says, "That's absolutely great." So the ITO regulation, the West is doing things to propagate this more broadly. How
Mm.
best do you think regulators can enforce the regulations they assert?
Um, so I'm going to make the assumption that when you're talking about the regulations to assert, the ITO regulations to assert. So actually part of my desire to come here today was to put together, or not to put together, I don't know, just plant the seed of putting together a committee for South Africa particularly, because I think before those regulations are implemented in South Africa, they need to be reviewed to whether they are appropriate for our context. But secondly, I do know that there is a a law practice, a law firm in Johannesburg called ALT Advisory, and there would probably be a better source to address that kind of question in terms of regulation. I myself am very selfish at the moment. I'm just looking for things to help me do my work better at the moment. But I'm eagerly waiting a committee or regulation that will help me do so. But yeah.
Awesome. And then just to clarify for everybody, ITO is in terms of, thanks for that, Karen.
Hello.
Yeah, we're living in the world of acronyms. That's how we do it now. Everything's got to be really, really quick. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We'll hope you join us again in the future. Maybe we can do a panel at some point to discuss things and debate some topics and gain different perspectives on it. So hopefully we can do that. But I hope everybody has a really wonderful day. Thank you for joining us and keep well.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.